Protesters defy curfews across the country as President Trump calls for law enforcement to, quote, dominate the streets. It comes as more states reopen with concern that the protests could hamper progress when it comes to coronavirus. Here's what you need to know. Good morning. This is Cheddar's Need2Know podcast for Tuesday, June 2nd. I am Jill Wagner with Carlo Versano. Carlo, good morning. How you doing?
Definitely got some fall of Western civilization vibes out here this morning in Brooklyn. I don't know if you're feeling that in the suburbs or not, but strange days, Jill.
Yeah, no, we are probably not as much as you guys in the city, but, scary times right now. And I do want to start once again with peaceful protests that were marred by scenes of violence in cities across the country once again last night. We will get to that in a moment and kind of do a rundown of where things stand. But first, a remarkable scene outside of the White House, and I want to set the stage here. So it was in the 6 p.m. hour. And we finally heard from President Trump, who delivered a statement in the Rose Garden, calling himself the law and order president, saying that if states cannot get the violence from the protests under control, that he would send in the military. So, okay, then the president and some of his family members and staff walked from the White House to St. John's Church, which was damaged by a fire the night before. Okay, so this is kind of the backdrop here. And that's when military police used flash grenades and tear gas to disperse peaceful protesters who were outside of the White House. And it was all to clear a path for President Trump to walk to that church for a photo op where he held up a Bible. He didn't really
upside
say
down,
much.
by the way. Yeah.
It was pretty unbelievable.
Jill, it was a remarkable moment.
I don't know
gotta
why
say,
my voice is so high, but that's, I don't know.
My wife always makes fun of me when my voice goes up like that when I'm saying something. But no, Jill, you and I have been covering this, just for years now, and this, I gotta say, this was a really strange thing that happened during the dinner hour last night. I mean, this is the kind of thing you see in like Caracas, right? Like peaceful protesters getting dispersed in front of the presidential palace by armed, military police and tear gas. Really remarkable. I mean, look, politically speaking, what President Trump is trying to do here is he wants to be seen as the law and order president, right? Because obviously, anything that takes the attention off of the pandemic and the federal response to the pandemic, I think the political belief is that would help him in November. I mean, it's not showing, the polls aren't showing that to be the case, but I certainly understand why he wants this to be his sort of issue. But alas.
Right. So the backstory of this is apparently that the president was disappointed in the media coverage of him going to an underground bunker over the weekend when there were protests. I just want to interject because I was reading kind of a TikTok, as it's called, which is, the behind the scenes of what happened leading up to this. And the Washington Post interviewed Brendan Buck, who's a Republican operative. He used to be an aide on the Hill. And I think this says it. He says, quote, "We long ago lost sight of normal, but this was a singularly immoral act. The president used force against American citizens, not to protect property, but to soothe his own insecurities. We will all move on to the next outrage, but this was a true abuse of power and should not be forgotten."
That's a great quote. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, what do you say, right? I think that nails it.
All right, let's talk about what did happen overnight. In New York City, peaceful protests, once again, though, overshadowed by looters who moved into Midtown Manhattan, smashing windows at stores on Fifth Avenue, ransacking Macy's iconic flagship store on 34th Street. Once again, scenes that played out on social media showed several instances of police appearing to clear peaceful gatherings with force. The president, again, speaking from the Rose Garden, says that the looting and the violent demonstrations were acts of domestic terror, and he is calling for police to, quote, dominate the streets.
Which is exactly what they did here in New York last night, Jill. The NYPD had double the number of cops out on the streets last night from the night prior, according to Governor Cuomo, 4,000 to 8,000. And yet still, they let Macy's get looted. I mean, I don't really get that. This story is really tough, and I was having a really hard time last night trying to get my head around it. Because, on the one hand, the idea that the police have been insufficiently forceful is like kind of ridiculous. And I don't think that, as a general rule of thumb, I think that what needs to happen is a de-escalation, right? And the de-escalation is not going to happen by doubling the amount of cops on the street and clashing with peaceful protesters, whether it's in front of the White House or in the streets of Brooklyn. But, on the other hand, Jill, look, if I'm a small business owner and I've been scraping by these last 3 months, wondering if I'm even going to, if my business is even going to survive and I'm even going to be able to pay my employees because of the pandemic. And now I'm finally maybe able to reopen, or at least start to think about reopening. And I show up at my shop and my windows are smashed. I'd be pretty damn pissed off. So I don't think there's any excuse for looting. And I think that the problem was when people start doing that, they just take away from what is, I believe to be a noble cause that this was all started over. Does that make sense?
I mean, look, George Floyd's brother in Minneapolis last night is calling for peace. All right, but Carlo, I'm a little confused, and I've been trying to kind of wrap my hands around what is going on. So you have the vast majority of people who are peacefully protesting, right? Who are
Yep.
standing up for police brutality. Standing up against police brutality against the Black community. Okay. Then you have these anarchists, right? You have Antifa and other groups like that they're not wholly organized, but they are a little bit more organized. I was reading a report from NBC News where they go to cause trouble, right? That's what they're doing.
Sure, yeah.
They go with backpacks that have gasoline, machetes. Their sole purpose is to kind of just take advantage of the chaos and cause mayhem. Okay. And then additionally, do you have just looters? You have people who maybe have been, home for however long, and they're taking advantage of it to steal some stuff. I mean, so is that what it is?
I think so. I mean, look, I think
out what's going on.
No, I think I think it's a valid question. I think we really don't actually even know quite what's happening yet, what the makeup of these different groups are. But look, my gut would say that, it's no coincidence that this is happening when there's 40 million people out of work in this country, right? And, teenagers have been stuck inside for the last 2 months. It's all part of, this is all one tinderbox that is now erupting. But yeah, no, to your point, Jill, I think that there's different groups, right? And there's no question that the vast majority of these people are out in the streets agitating for change. They're not trying to steal Nikes,
Right, which is the most frustrating part, because it seems like we are at this watershed moment. And I understand why states are saying, look, we have to have curfews because you do need people to feel safe. I'm right now on Long Island, but I live 2 blocks from where there was massive looting, and we were texting with a friend of ours who was in our building, and he's like, with their 17-month-old daughter sleeping, and they're scared.
Of course,
it's not an understatement. It's frightening, and it's like, if I was a protester out there, and I was just trying to be peaceful and get my message out, this is so incredibly frustrating that a very small minority of people are kind of taking advantage of this moment.
Absolutely, yeah, no question.
Meanwhile, of course, this is all happening as a private autopsy ordered by George Floyd's family found that his cause of death was homicide caused by asphyxia, and that he had no underlying health conditions that would have contributed to his death. And that would contradict the preliminary results from the official autopsy from the county medical examiner, which discounted asphyxia or strangulation as the main cause of his death. The family's autopsy report also concludes that Floyd died at the scene. The Floyd family's lawyer is calling for the charges against Derek Chauvin to be upgraded to first-degree murder, and that the other 3 officers at the scene be arrested.
Yeah. So one of the reason why they're calling for these other 3 cops to be arrested is because the this autopsy, this private autopsy, found that a contributing factor to Floyd's death was in addition to the knee on the back of his neck, the cut off circulation, was the force on his back from these other 2 officers who were holding him down. So that's an important
either
point
way, they saw what was going on.
Oh no, of course, yeah. I mean, these
the whole
at
thing
the very
is
least, it's such a moral abomination, regardless of what the law is. But and I don't mean to go back, but I do want to say one more thing about the protest, Jill. It's Pride Month, right? Like today's June 2nd. I believe Cheddar actually has we're doing a special on celebrating Pride this year. The reason why people celebrate Pride today, it's not because there were nonviolent protests 50 years ago, right? There was major civil unrest in this country, especially here in New York City. The Stonewall riots, right? They were violent. The Stonewall riots being violent is the reason why you go to a Pride parade in 2020 and, Bank of America is sponsoring the floats, right? Budweiser runs Pride commercials. Change doesn't happen because of peaceful demonstrations, almost never. And I'm sorry to burst people's bubble, but it's just a fact. I mean, in 2003, you had the largest coordinated protest in global history against the Iraq War. Up until that point, at least. And what did that do? It didn't do a damn thing. The Women's March in 2017, I hate to say it, but for all those people that were out on the streets, what did that accomplish other than making people feel better about themselves? And I say that as somebody who was there for both of those events. So I just want to try and make the point that, this is why this is such a tricky issue, right? Because nonviolent protests, not necessarily the way to affect change in America. On the flip side, defying curfew and looting the local shoe store or, smash and grabbing at Macy's certainly isn't going to do it either, right? I'm sorry to go back to where we just were.
No. It's a really interesting. I interviewed someone on Cheddar yesterday, a scholar, and he wrote a book about Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. And he was saying, despite the fact that history looks back at these as 2 very different types of leaders, very different types of civil rights leaders with different approaches, they actually were a lot more similar than you would think. And a lot of the civil rights protesters, he was pointing to, said John Lewis, Congressman John Lewis, I think he had his skull broken. He was basically, beaten while protesting. And he wasn't doing the violence, but he was subject to it.
Well, Martin Luther King was one of the most hated people in America at the time of his death, right? So everybody now who is like, you put MLK quotes in their like Twitter profile or whatever, most of those people probably would have hated him in 1967. But alas.
Okay, I want to get to the latest now on the pandemic. So Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer has lifted that state's stay-at-home order, which allows bars and restaurants to reopen across the state. There are some restrictions. In New York, in the tri-state area, new coronavirus case numbers have significantly dropped in recent days. New Jersey will be reopening retail and restaurants for outdoor dining starting June 15th. And New York Governor Andrew Cuomo says he is concerned that these protests will spark a second wave of infections, just when we appear to be getting this under control.
Yeah, so that's we're not going to know for probably a week or 2 because of just how the latency and how this virus spreads. But it'll it'll be very interesting at the very least to see because these are all outdoor gatherings, right? It'll be very interesting to see if how well this virus is spreading outdoors at this point, which is one of the big questions. We don't think it's nearly as bad as it would be indoors, but you have to assume that some of these people on the streets, especially here in New York, but in other places, have this virus, right?
Yeah, I mean, to your point, I just think it'll test transmission outdoors. People are not able to stay 6 feet apart. So, again, we won't unfortunately know the toll for another couple of weeks. Meanwhile, dozens of Facebook employees, I actually think it was more like hundreds of Facebook employees, virtually walked off the job in protest of Facebook's decision to let controversial and inflammatory posts from President Trump stay on the platform. It was a rare show of dissent within the company, aimed exclusively at CEO Mark Zuckerberg, who essentially has the decision-making power at Facebook.
Yeah,
Really
I mean,
interesting.
this is, he's going to address employees today on this walkout and other issues at one of their all hands meetings. But Jill, like you said, Zuck is effectively like the emperor of Facebook, right? Because of how the power structure at that company works, he is the be all and the end all. You can make an argument he's the most influential person on the planet, frankly. But I think why this is important and why people should be paying attention to this, it's very rare for Facebook employees to speak out en masse like this. They have a very sort of cult-like culture there. I don't mean that with any disrespect. It's just like how it is. I know of several people who work at Facebook, and they definitely people there definitely like to drink the Kool-Aid. But this is it's not exactly has to do with the protest, but it kind of does, right? Zuckerberg is in a really tough place right now, especially ahead of the election, and as President Trump is going to continue to really spread misinformation wherever he can, whether it's Twitter, Facebook, or elsewhere, right?
I mean, look, Zuckerberg came out and basically said Twitter's decision to slap a warning on some of the president's tweets, he said it was the wrong decision. Yeah. And apparently a lot of his employees would disagree with him there. So I'm curious to see what comes out of that all hands. In a viral new ad, though, Nike flipping its famous tagline, telling the audience, for once, don't do it, and imploring people do not ignore issues of racism. The official Adidas Twitter account actually retweeted the ad with the message, together is how we move forward. Together is how we make change. It was a really powerful ad.
It's a good ad. And, Nike is one of those companies that they're very good at leaning into controversy and leaning into sort of like social justice issues. And I give them credit for that because they walk the walk. They always have. They've always been a pretty socially conscious company, I guess, except for the sweatshops. But there is something that makes me kind of queasy when all of these brands feel the need to jump into these major political or social justice stories. Like, do we need a statement from L'Oreal saying like they support Black Lives Matter? In the same way, like, do I need to see a tweet from Cheerios on 9/11 telling me like never forget? Maybe I'm being the old Carlo here and a little too cynical for my own good. But I don't know. I just never really like it. It always just gives me kind of like the willies when these companies start to get involved.
Listen, I think Nike took it's an interesting time because it wasn't long ago that a business did not want to ever wade into any sort of social issue.
Sure.
That did start to change a bit. We saw Dick's pull big, assault rifles and guns, Dick's Sporting Goods. Nike leaned into Colin Kaepernick. They made him their face of their 30th anniversary ad. And you know what? It paid off. Sales went up. Shares of Nike went up. And to your cynical nature, I wouldn't disagree. I think companies realize maybe it's the right thing to do, but it also is good business. Millennials especially millennials and younger buyers, want to feel good about purchases, and they want to feel like the company that they're buying something from is socially conscious. So
it's a really interesting change. I mean, you watched the Michael Jordan documentary, right? The Last Dance. I thought one of the most interesting things in that doc was when they were talking about these issues, about like when political issues came up in the 90s and how Jordan was, famously apolitical and didn't want to get in the middle of it, and how different that is now, right? It's just a completely different way in which sort of corporations feel like they now, and not just corporations, but like athletes and celebrities, right?
Taylor Swift had that. I can't believe I'm comparing Michael Jordan to Taylor Swift. I'm sorry. But Taylor Swift, in her documentary, she talked about kind of that decision that she made to get political and get involved in a local race in Tennessee. And her parents were like, you cannot do this. Look what happened to the Dixie Chicks who spoke out against George W. Bush and the Iraq War. You can't do it. It's a different time. And I think that people now expect it. Customers and fans now expect, especially with social media, to know where a company or a person stands on stuff.
Taylor Swift, by the way, just came out hard against the president last week. on Twitter. I forget exactly what she said, but it was really more serious than she's been in terms of getting into politics.
Another sign, by the way, that the rest of the year may be awash when it comes to live events. New York's Metropolitan Opera, the largest performing arts organization in the country, has canceled its fall season because of the coronavirus pandemic. And given the Met's size and clout in the arts world, it could be the first of many organizations that rely on large in-person audiences to decide to throw in the towel on performances for the year.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, again, I think I've said this 100 times at this point, but like, you're not going to a concert or a show or an opera until there's a vaccine. I don't see it. The one thing on this I am very curious about, though, is the conventions, Jill, because I thought for sure there was not going to be either a DNC or an RNC this summer. And now I'm not so sure. It sounds like the RNC is basically moving forward. The DNC, I mean, if the Republicans do it, the Democrats are going to feel like they have to do it too. So maybe they'll do it virtually and not have people in the big arenas. But the whole point of those conventions is to like bring the masses in and participate in the process. So I don't know, but that's definitely something to keep an eye on these next few weeks.
Absolutely. All right, let's end this thing on some good news. Carlo, what do you have?
Okay, so I wanted to flag something. Some comments I saw yesterday from a senior Italian doctor who's been fighting COVID in Milan, on the front lines in Milan there for the last couple of months. He told Italian TV RAI that the virus, quote, clinically no longer exists in Italy. So I wanted to flag this because he's basically saying that the strain of virus that they're now seeing there is weakening. So it's mutating, but it's mutating to become weaker. So this is just one doctor saying this, but it does point to the possibility that a second wave may not be as severe as we thought. I'm not saying that's a certainty. Italy's own government saying not to put too much stock in this. He caused a little bit of a wave when he said this there, but it's a promising thread to follow, which we will.
That's very, very welcoming news. Okay,
hopefully,
My good news is just that Friday is National or International Donut Day. And in honor of that, I know this is just as unimportant
I love
perhaps
donuts,
as you could say, but
no, I'm not.
Krispy Kreme is giving out free donuts all week. No purchase necessary. Not for delivery, though. So you actually do need to go to a Krispy Kreme store. Dunkin' Donuts, by the way, is going to be giving out free donuts on Friday. And I believe you do have to purchase a beverage, but you can get a free donut on Friday. But Carlo, I'm not joking you. I kid you not, last night before I went to bed, as I'm watching the protests and I'm texting with friends who are really scared about what's going on, I'm like, I need good news. I don't have any good news. So I spent a lot of time trying to find this piece of good news. And I
honestly, Jill,
brightens everyone's day.
Of all of the good news we ever say, this is probably the most useful.
Yeah, right? News you can use.
It's very actionable.
Okay, everyone out there, please write us. Tell us what you think about what's going on in the world right now. It's
we
just
could use some
unsettling times. I'd love to hear from everybody. What do you think about what Carlo and I said, or just me, or just whatever it may be? We'd love to hear from you and get your thoughts. And just even if you want to vent or whatever it is, we'll listen.
Jill.Wagner. No, I'm just kidding. Need2Know, the number 2 at Cheddar.com.
No, listen, in a real way, I don't want to go on longer than we should, but this is not a comfortable stuff to talk about, right?
No.
And it's not comfortable what's happening in this country right now, but it has to happen. And I don't know. I mean, it's not. These aren't easy conversations to be having.
No, absolutely not. I mean, Jill, you and I have both been around. I mean, we're not like old geezers, but we've been around, this business a while, and it's never been like this in my life, just in terms of the amount of unsettling news, right? So people feel it.
We're young.
Crazy.
And it's funny because I'm staying with my in-laws, and I was talking to my father-in-law, and he has such a different perspective because he's like, I've kind of been through a lot of this. You know what I mean? He's like, I've lived through Vietnam protests. I've lived through race riots and race protests. And it's just, this feels like a different moment right now. This really feels like a watershed moment.
and not to belabor it again, but it's just that sense of there's so much happening at once. And I think that's what's really unsettling, and people should feel that, and that it's totally normal. You're not crazy to feel that way, right? We feel it, and we cover it all day long.
Okay, we got to wrap. That's what you need to know for Tuesday, June 2nd. Bye, everybody.
See you later, folks.